All right, testing. Is this thing on? Check 1, 2. That looks and sounds good. Let's everything appears to be working. I'm here. You're here. Hopefully, maybe you're not here. Hello and welcome to yet another Ableton Office Hours stream. My name is Zaak Kerstetter, and this is something I do on Tuesday afternoons, where I will kind of be hanging out and just talking about making music with Ableton Live with all you lovely people, again, who may or may not be here. And yeah, that's kind of the idea here. If you guys are interested in learning more about kind of what we're doing, I also stream on Fridays, and on Fridays, the format is a little different. Fridays are a song feedback stream where people will send me tracks that they are working on, and I will take a listen to them and give them my feedback on it. But today is just for hanging out, chatting, talking about making music, answering questions if there are any. Otherwise, usually just doing weird sound design, or just sometimes I'll just go on rants about different things that are worth noting in Ableton Live. I'm also getting a little message down here at the bottom of the screen that 11.0.5 is downloading. And that is something I'm very excited about. Hopefully, it seems like with each one of the mini versions of Live, they are dealing with a lot of the CPU issues that people are running into. So I'm excited to test that out and see if that actually makes any difference on the CPU and where we're sitting on that, because I have been hearing conflicting reports from all across the board of people saying the CPU is fine and people who are saying that it's completely and totally unusable. Mine is somewhere in the middle. It's mostly usable, but can be a little bit weird sometimes. I think part of that is just the M1 chip deals with CPU in a different way than the live CPU meter is generally reading things. Cool. Well, I'm gonna go ahead and just start doing some stuff. I think, what would I like to work on today? I think what I need to do is I need to figure out, or I want to figure out how to make some like really interesting, weird pitchy sounds, pitch envelope kind of sounds. I feel like that's something that it's a sound I've been hearing a lot in a lot of different kinds of music. And I want to do some kind of like arpeggiated, pitchy thing that just sounds kind of crazy that I can use in like the like drop or main part of my song. So I really like the pitch envelope and operator, but I want to play around and use like envelope 2 here to do a little like pitch kind of thing. Something like that. Just kind of like goofy, weird, pitchy sound. Let's put a little unison on that. And I think playing with this pitch envelope, I think, can yield a lot of really interesting results depending on how you kind of adjust things and play with the curve. It's kind of cool. Let's keep the saw wave and let's do something kind of interesting over here. And what if we do the same envelope on oscillator 2 position? Let's put the saw wave up. I kind of like that. Thinking behind that as a sound, and then anything else I want to do here? I could try filter envelope. I think that'll ruin a lot of my pitchy stuff that I'm actually kind of going for. Not the resonance on the frequency. What's up, Michael? How are you doing today? You have not really missed a whole lot. I started a tiny bit late just because I had a lesson earlier that went a little bit over. But I wanted to do some weird kind of pitchy thing. I've been feeling like that's been missing in some songs that I've been writing. I want to write a song that's basically just like big, huge 808 beat and then a lot of like really weird psychedelic high pitch sounds on top of it. That's kind of a vibe I've been feeling recently. So I wanted to do some sound design where I make some like interesting, weird pitch bendy sounds. So that's kind of the main idea. Just doing a lot of pitch envelope. Let's make this an even octave. And just trying to kind of see what I can do with it. There's this saw wave and then like another kind of weird waveform with it. I can't decide if I like it better with the really high pitched kind of sound or the kind of like mids or the lows. Like this has a kind of cool effect to it, but I think that's really the sweet spot here. So we'll take something like that, and I might have to like adjust the volume envelope a little bit. Like that, and let's see what happens if I do like a really fast arpeggiator on it. Yeah, that's kind of what I'm going for, I feel like. I'm not even sure what the filter here is really necessary. Yeah, that's kind of what I'm going for, I feel like. What if I do? No. That'd be a single note. Michael, if you have any questions, feel free to toss them in the chat, or if anybody else does out there. Right now, I'm just kind of screwing around, making some noises. But the plan today was just to hang out and see what you guys were into. And with a little delay on that. So you've been working on a track and you want some airy piano keys. Any advice on how to achieve that? Yeah. Biggest advice is just go nuts with the reverb. I think that's probably the best way to do it. I think there's a lot of good instruments in like Contact. There's some like really interesting piano instruments that have some like cool like airy piano sound as kind of like built into the patch itself. But if you're starting from scratch, if you're basically just doing like a pretty clean piano kind of thing, the Ableton grand piano is actually not a bad piano. I actually don't really mind that. But if you're going for airy, things like a shimmer reverb, amethyst harp. Let me check that preset to make sure, because airy could also mean a lot of different things. Let me just test this out real quick. Yeah, this has a very kind of like plucky sound to it. Is that something you're trying to maintain? Is that something you want to like keep in there, or do you want to go for more of like a smoother, airy kind of sound? Because that would make a difference there. But yeah, go nuts with reverbs. I mean, the live reverb's okay. Convolution reverb is great. Hybrid reverb is great. If you have access to any of the Valhalla reverbs, those would be hands down the ones I would go to make a very airy kind of sound, especially something like Shimmer. So if you have access to any of the Valhalla reverbs, if you don't, just go ahead and buy those because they're excellent, amazing plugins. But if you don't want to do that, hybrid reverb. And a lot of times if I'm doing hybrid reverb kind of stuff, because it can be a little complicated to do both at the same time. So a lot of times I'll do like just the algorithm first, get that kind of dialed in the way I want, and then do just the convolution to get that the way I want. And that way you can kind of like mix and match the two together. So there's a lot of really great spaces in here, like the real places. A lot of these are like pretty huge. I'm gonna crank up the dry wet. And already that has like a nice kind of like airiness to it. It sounds really far away, but to me that kind of sounds airy. Let's try a few others. Ooh, I like that one. Yeah, we'll keep that. And then if you need to, you can play with the size and the decay to make it not quite as like obvious. Or make it super, super obvious. So we'll keep that. We'll go over to algorithm. Play with some of these settings a little bit. That could work. Shimmer is excellent. That to me just really is airy. So we'll keep those settings, combine the two of them together. I like them parallel a lot better than I do serial. I've noticed some weird things in the serial setting where even if you like go 100% algorithmic, you still get a little bit of the convolution. And so like if you have a convolution with a really long tail, that means you're going to get these like crazy long reverbs because you have like the long tail going into another one that also has a long tail. So you get these like overwhelmingly long reverbs. Yeah, exactly. So I'll do convolution. It doesn't really matter which order you do them in. Just do one at a time and then combine them together. But I tend to like it a little better on parallel than I do on serial for the most part if I'm doing it this way. So we can listen to it here first. That's pretty nice and airy, in my opinion, versus parallel. They sound pretty similar in this case, but yeah, something like that. And then you control your dry wet kind of to taste. I think if I'm going for an airy thing, I want this to actually be pretty high. Another option that you could kind of combine with that is echo. Echo has a really excellent built-in reverb. The reverb here just sounds really solid. So maybe I go with like a fast delay. And then combine that with the reverb. And you get this thing that's like almost not even really a piano anymore. It's like it's mostly the reverb and the delay that are kind of just like creating almost this kind of pad sound. But between these two, you can just get like these really pretty sounds. We'll do a little ping pong. little more feedback, maybe a little slower delay time. Maybe a little bit less shimmer in there. This is great. I'm actually enjoying this quite a bit. I'd have to save this as a preset. What's up, Alex? How are you doing today? So you asked, seems like you got a multi-part question here. So what decibel deficit do you normally start with, bass melody, etc., in order to give yourself room for mastering? And do you do any mastering while designing, or do you wait till the track is done? Those are fantastic questions. So first off, my general workflow when it goes from like production to mixing to mastering is, in terms of volume levels, is I usually, when I'm producing and just working on a track, I shoot for about 12 decibels of a headroom on the master. So when I'm producing, if I go over a little bit, it's not a huge deal. But basically, that's roughly 12 decibels headroom when producing. Then when I'm mixing, just naturally through the process of mixing, I will kind of move from -12 to -6 just by things kind of being turned up and like I need one more kick, need one more bass, things kind of switch around. So, and this is only on the master that I'm really talking about here. Like volumes on individual tracks are kind of whatever you want it to be. So through the process of mixing, I go from -12 to -6. And then when I am mastering, I go from -6 basically up to 0 as far up as I want to push it. And that's just generally kind of the progression of volumes of headroom on my master track. In terms of mastering while I'm producing or designing or doing stuff, I pretty much always wait till the end. I know a number of people out there who like will produce and mix with mastering stuff on their master, and I'd say probably 20% of those people, maybe less, maybe 10 to 15% of those people really know what they're doing. They're like really understand the process of mixing and mastering, and it's like they can pull it off. The other like 80 to 90% of the people who are producing and mixing with stuff on their master do not necessarily understand the complex relationship between dynamics and things like that. So it's kind of weird. I don't mix or produce with stuff on my master. I know a handful of people who can do it and they pull it off really well, and I think they're geniuses for doing that basically. And I know a lot of people who think that because these handful of people can do it, that they can do it, and it ends up kind of being counterproductive to them. So yeah, I usually wait to the end to do mastering stuff. But not that being said, I think you can get away with just producing with stuff on your master, and people have done it, and people have made hit records doing it, and been very successful. So it's totally possible. Yeah, most mastering engineers, Michael, are one about 6 decibels of headroom to work with. Just because if you don't give them that, then they can't really do a whole lot. I've seen mastering engineers, if you give them more than 6 decibels, great, they love it. I've seen them accept tracks up to -3 decibels, but honestly, shoot for -6. Like, keep your mastering engineer happy. Like, work with them a little bit and give them a decent amount of headroom so they can do their job and make a difference. So, Alex, generally the process of mastering is going to be done on the master track itself. It's basically like you do all your mixing, where you have all your EQs and compressors and effects on all of your individual tracks, and then you usually will bounce that out as like a single stereo wave file, and then that's what gets run through the master. So mastering on individual tracks is not really a thing. That would be more like mixing, I guess. The one exception to that would be I've seen people master their stems for live performance. So if you are an artist going out on stage and you want to be able to like play different things out live on stage, which requires you to be basically playing to your stems as opposed to playing to just a full backing track. I've seen people master their stems for that particular reason, but usually they're not mastering every single stem. They'll be like 5 to 8 groups that they'll be mastering. But that's a very specific, very niche situation that is not super common. But yeah, if you're going to be doing a bunch of processing to individual tracks, that would be more of the mixing side of things, in my opinion. Those are great questions, though. Yeah, mastering is one of those things that it's really hard to get good, solid information about it, and everybody's kind of process around mastering is a little different, and people's opinions on mastering vary greatly. I know a number of people who have basically like they spend tons and tons of time on the mix to make their mix perfect, and then they do barely any mastering because they're so detail oriented when they're mixing to make everything exactly what you want, and they just like run it through a limiter and then like call it a day, which is a cool way to do it. So yeah, if anybody else has any questions or things they want to talk about, feel free to toss it in the chat. That's just kind of what we're doing today. Yeah, I know people who do exactly that, Alex, where they're just like, okay, toss the limiter on it, crank it up the gain a little bit, and I've seen it work really well. But I think in order for that to work really well, the mix has to be like very pristine. So Michael's asking about, since we're talking about mastering, what audio effects and VSTs do you usually use on your master channel and in what order? Another fantastic question. So the quick and dirty way to do it, it would be just to use Ozone. That's one of the reasons Ozone is super popular and well known. Do I have Ozone on this computer? I don't think I installed Ozone. No, I did not. Ozone is really nice because it's kind of your one-stop shop for mastering. You can buy that one thing. It's got all the things you need. It's got the EQs, it's got the compressors, it's got the stereo imaging, it's got the limiters. It's all right there. It's very visual. It's you don't need to kind of like buy a bunch of different stuff to make it work. You can just make it happen. I would say if you are interested in like dipping your toe in mastering, Ozone is a pretty solid place to start because it has all the key components are all right there. However, as you kind of get deeper into the mastering world, you will be kind of most likely moving away from Ozone and either using, replacing bits and pieces with Ozone with other third-party plugins, in which case the place I would recommend doing that is FabFilter. FabFilter has got pretty much everything you need to do mastering in their bundle. So you could use, Pro C as your compressor. You got your EQs. You got Saturn for a little bit of saturation. You got Pro L as your limiter. These are all like excellent things, excellent VSTs. So in the past, I haven't done a lot of mastering recently myself. But if I were to kind of like rebuild my mastering chain from scratch, I would probably use like maybe 15% Ozone, and then the other 85% I would probably replace with the FabFilter devices. On top of that, if you really want to, if you just want to like learn the basics of mastering and see if you like it, you can build a mastering chain with 100% live devices. And I've actually done this. I should still have this in here. So here is my 100% in the box mastering chain. That I made this a while ago, so I'd probably tweak it a little bit before if I were to like redo it. But this is based off of my Ozone mastering chain. So I basically was trying to recreate the kind of signal flow for mastering in Ozone, but I did it with all live devices. And this actually sounds pretty good. I actually get some pretty decent results out of this. But basically, I start with the mid-side EQ. So just using an EQ8 with the mid-side option turned on, and that way I can EQ the mids a little bit separately from from the sides. I then have a multi-band saturator. So just a bunch of saturators stacked on top of each other. I have a multiband compressor, which again is just a bunch of compressors stacked on top of each other. I have a width control, which is a bunch of utility devices. And then I have a limiter here. And actually in an updated version of this, I actually have 2 limiters, because 2 limiters is the way to do it, where each limiter touches a little bit. So this is my kind of like, I'm trying to recreate a my Ozone mastering chain with 100% in the box live devices. So I'd do something kind of like this, but I'd use like mostly FabFilter plugins is probably how I'd redo it if I were to build myself a new mastering chain, and then use like a little bit of Ozone, but mostly FabFilter. On top of that, just to kind of, if we're talking about mastering and kind of like how mastering works, is that talking about mastering. If you actually like really want to get into mastering, like a real legit mastering engineer is not going to be using plugins. They're going to be using hardware, like a hardware compressor and a hardware limiter. And that's, I think, part of what you're paying for when you're paying for a professional mastering engineer, is not only their years of experience and their ears, but also for them to run it through some hardware. And mastering hardware is super expensive. We're talking like, a couple $100,000 for like a legit mastering studio. So Ozone's nice because it's not that expensive compared to how expensive building a whole mastering studio is, and like getting really into mastering can actually be. Or you can kind of use different plugins, but I don't think there's anything like super magical in Ozone that you can't replace with other plugins, for example. All right, so Alex is asking a little bit about, notice when people EQ, they'll pull the EQ up in certain places and look for high peaks and then turn the EQ in these spots. Can you elaborate exactly what is being done? That is a great question. So you're talking about the hunt and kill method, or search and destroy, depending on who you talk to. I like to use hunt and kill. Other people like to use search and destroy. Same thing though. So what you're doing is you're looking for frequencies that stand out. And sometimes this will be fairly obvious, and sometimes you really have to like listen really closely in a mix to kind of like hear for these. So if we're going back to our like echo piano sound, there might be some frequencies out here. So you can see there's all these spikes in volume there. Those are all your different harmonics. There might be a frequency in here that might just be a little bit louder than it needs to be. And sometimes it can be very hard to identify those, because you might not know exactly what frequency is causing it. So by doing the hunt and kill method, what you do is you first boost the frequencies with a pretty refined resonance. And that way, as you play, you can essentially hear which one's being turned up. So basically you're boosting the frequency to bring it out even more so you can hear it, to make sure you get exactly the right spot. So like, for example, say that one frequency is bothering me. I have now identified it. I have now hunted it down, and I can turn the resonance, and then I just turn the gain down, and that way just that one frequency, that one harmonic, is being eliminated without anything on either side of it actually being affected. So that's something I'll do quite a bit when I'm mixing, just to kind of like, if I can, I'll hear a frequency that's louder than it's supposed to be, but I can't identify it just by hearing. I don't have like perfect pitch or anything like that. But by doing this, I can identify it just by hearing it. And then you just get rid of it. Yeah, it's a really fantastic technique for dialing your mixes and getting those like little pesky frequencies that will add up in your mix and kind of drive you nuts. What's up, love? How you doing? It's been a while. And pretty much any EQ can do this. You just crank it up. Make sure you have a pretty refined resonance, and then once you find it, turn the gain down. That's all there is to it. You don't always need to do this. I only really do this when there are frequencies that are actually kind of sticking out. Oh yeah, you can also use the headphone guy over here, the preview guy. I think this is what Love's talking about. This guy right here. When you turn this on, and I click on one of these bands, it will only play frequencies affected by this. So now I'm just listening to whatever's being affected there. That's what this little headphone guy does. So this is, if you're having trouble finding those frequencies, this is a great way to even further isolate it so you can find exactly where it is and then get rid of it. So Michael is asking about, I was wondering if you, so if you get a snare to punch through the mix, figure out what the main frequency is, let's say 300, and go through the track to dip that frequency. That's not that silly. I will do that sometimes with things like vocals, for example. Not so much with snares. Or if I have like different melody parts that are in kind of similar frequency range. If there's like a really important sound, I will dip other things in that kind of frequency range just so it really it kind of kills the competition in that range. Snares, I would more likely just boost it a little bit. So when it comes to EQing, there's two ways to do EQing, obviously. There's either additive EQing, where you're boosting things, and there's subtractive EQing, where you're cutting things down. I know a lot of people that are very much into like only subtractive EQing. That's like the main way you should do EQing. I personally think that if you're doing subtractive EQing, go nuts with it. You can do, have crazy huge curves here, and that's not a big deal. When you're doing any additive EQing, you can do it, but just be subtle about it. So for example, I wouldn't do an additive EQ that looks like this. This would be like way too much boosting. Whereas, if it's under 6 decibels, if it's something like this is a little bit more reasonable. So yeah, I would boost the snare a little bit, but I wouldn't necessarily go through every other track and turn it down exactly at 300 hertz or whatever frequency it's at. That seems like a lot of work with not a lot of payoff. I would just turn up the volume on the snare and maybe boost that particular frequency a little bit if I need to. Or what Love suggested, which is sidechain other sounds to the snare. That would also work to help kind of bring the snare out a little bit. And just make sure you get the kind of compression on your snare so that you get like these nice clear transients. Snares are weird though, because they tend to be very noisy, and so they have like a really wide frequency range. So sometimes you have to like find exactly that spot where you get that nice kind of like crunchy impact of your snare and then boost that a little bit. Yeah, these are great questions so far. Yeah, EQing and mixing are weird though. I generally think that with EQing and mixing, less is more in terms of like the techniques you're using. A lot of times the like real simple basic things like, a little bit of boosting, a little bit of cutting, get you the most results and can be super effective. I see a lot of people with like EQ curves that like look like this or something, where they're just like, they're all over. It's like the Rocky Mountains. That tends to be in a lot of cases like way overthinking and way overcomplicating things, when just doing like subtle little changes like that can be a lot more effective in either direction, both boosting and cutting. Any other questions about EQing or otherwise? These are great questions so far. Yeah, Alex, that is something people run into a lot. Well, first again, Lev, so using the Rocky Mountain EQs for rim gauze is great, but I think there's a philosophical and creative difference between using an EQ as an effect, so using like a phaser or a comb filter or something as an effect to like purposely shift the sounds, versus using an EQ as a utility to clean a sound. And I think that's where people overcomplicate things. I think go nuts with using your EQs for like interesting, weird sound design. But when it comes to like refining your sounds, less is more in a lot of the cases. But Alex is asking about distinguishing whether or not his tracks need more proper mastering or need to fix something in the mix. And you are definitely not alone in that. So the way I like to think about it is that mixing and mastering have two functional differences. The goal of mixing is clarity, in my opinion, more than anything else. When you're mixing, you want to make sure that you can hear every single sound exactly the amount that you need to. So the very important sounds, like the vocals or the drum beat or the bass line, should be very upfront in your mix. And the supporting character sounds should be kind of, they should be audible, but they don't need to be taking over the center of attention. And so you're clearing out space for clarity and maximizing clarity. So if something sounds too loud or something sounds too quiet or something sounds just too busy, there's too many things going on and it sounds confusing, that's an issue with your mix. And that's when you'd go back in and you would adjust your volumes, EQ things, compress things to make sure that all of the levels and relative volumes of all your tracks sit well together. That's kind of like what you're doing when you're mixing, for the most part. Mastering, the goal is to make it sound rich and full more than anything else. So if your song sounds a little quiet, it sounds a little dull, it sounds a little bit distant or far away, or it's not quite like hitting in exactly the way you want, that would be more of an issue for mastering. And that's where you'd go back in. Or if your master sounds like either not compressed enough or over compressed, those are the things you want to focus on when you're mastering. Generally, I recommend do the mix first, finish the mix as much as possible. Try to get it as clean and clear as possible. Then you do your master. And here's one of the things I've noticed. Once you do your first round of mastering, first round or two of mastering, you'll start to hear things in your mix that you couldn't hear before because of the way you're saturating things and compressing things and EQing things in your master. So you then go back to your mix, fix anything you've noticed in the mix, bounce it again, and then run it through your master again. If you find yourself bouncing back and forth a lot between mixing and mastering, that means your mix is just not done yet, and you need to spend more time focusing on your mix. But pretty much every song I've ever mastered, I've at least one time, usually twice, gone back, tweaked a few things in the mix, and then moved it back into mastering. So you don't want to be ping-ponging back and forth between the two different parts of your workflow. You want to kind of focus on one, focus on your mix, finish the mix, focus on the master. If you need to, you can go back to the mix, but try not to be bouncing back and forth all the time because you're going to end up wasting a bunch of time. So hopefully that kind of answers your question a little bit. A lot of it just comes down to really focusing and listening on exactly what is wrong with your song. Is it clarity or is it loudness and richness and fullness? Like, what are the things that it's missing? If it's clarity, it's a mix problem. If it's any of those other things, it's probably a mastering problem. Let me know if that makes sense. So if there are no other questions, show us how to EQ compress a snare from your screen. I can chain it put on. Yeah, sure. So let's grab snare. Yeah, love. I have occasionally mastered in my mix project, but I've stopped doing that just because it's easier for my brain to kind of have them in separate things. It also saves me a bunch of CPU, but I would definitely recommend people start mastering in a separate master session. All right, let's talk a little bit about snares. Let me find a snare sample. I'll take this one. All right, so here we got our snare. And we'll just do like a kind of like generic snare processing. So with snares, there's really kind of like three main effects I'm thinking about in a generic sense. Depending on the situation, I might get a little crazy with effects, but the three things you generally want are reverb, compressor, EQ. Generally, I like to put my reverbs on return tracks for my snares, and that way I can kind of maintain some of the volume and dynamics of my snare. So that's probably what I'm going to do, because this is not going to, I'm trying to like recreate how it actually mix a snare or like process a snare. So I'm going to replace this reverb with a different reverb. We're going to use vintage verb for my snare because that's probably my favorite reverb for snares. So I'm just going to put that on return track A. Cool, and we'll come back to that, and we'll do EQs and compressors first. All right, let's do the compression first, because compression I think is kind of interesting, especially when it comes to things like snares. So what we're going to do is we want to bring out a lot of the impact of this snare, right? And one of the biggest issues I've seen for a lot of people is if they're going to be compressing their just drums in general, is if I start turning the threshold down, we end up losing a lot of our kind of initial impact. Even if I turn the makeup gain on, some of the transients at the very beginning don't necessarily kind of like stand up. So what we're going to do here is we're going to give it a little bit of attack, and not a whole lot. Usually I found like 10 to 20 milliseconds of attack is usually plenty. So yeah, we'll do like 10 milliseconds attack. And what you're going to notice is when you do this, the gain reduction meter is going to start to move down slower, which means we're getting less compression on the initial impact of our snare. And I'm going to turn this down a little bit just so we have more headroom to work with. So now as I start to turn this down, we're getting more compression on the tail of our snare and less on the actual initial impact. Like that. That's actually quite a bit. I'll do something like that. So obviously we're losing a lot of volume there. And then you could either use the makeup gain button, which will automatically turn it back up for you, or you can manually do it. So I like to manually do it if I'm like actually going to be processing a snare like this. And I'm going to put this basically kind of like just underneath clipping. So going for something like that, or something like that. That's kind of quite a bit, but you kind of get the idea here. Maybe get a little bit more attack on this. So that's kind of what I'm looking for. And then you can kind of tweak it to taste as needed. So that's kind of like the basics of a compressor there. And then EQing, you'll notice, oops, wrong button. As I mentioned earlier, snares have this very wide frequency range. It's very broad. And generally, there's going to be a lot of low-end stuff that we don't really need. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to find the like kind of punch and impact. And the way I'm going to do this is just using the low cut and just moving it up until I can start to hear it. So right around here, you can actually see there's two different harmonics for impact. There's one right there, and there's one right there. But if I do something like this, we can get rid of any of those unwanted low frequencies. Now, if I want to bring this out in the mix a bit more, this one's kind of interesting because there's two harmonics for it. Usually there's one, or there's just like a spot where it's going to exist mostly. we're going to boost that area just a tiny bit. So if I want to bring out this harmonic more, that little part or this part. Or maybe both. Maybe I'll do something like this. I'll do a little bit over here. And do a little bit over here. Just to give it a little more of that kind of like impact, if I wanted to. Maybe something like that. I don't think I'm going to do a whole lot to the highs here. I think the highs are kind of fine. I could like tone them down a little bit if I wanted, but then it becomes a little too muted. I can maybe boost that a little bit to make it a little bit more noisy. So that might be how I EQ it. So yeah, so there's my compression and EQ. Now I need a little bit of reverb, so I'm going to start turning up my send A over on my Valhalla. And just by default, this is probably going to be a little bit too much. So first thing I'm going to do is turn the decay down. Depending on the reverb and depending on what you're going for, generally, I think the sweet spot for reverbs on snares is somewhere between about 600 milliseconds and about 1.5 seconds. Your mileage may vary on that, again, depending on the reverb and what style music you're making. So if I go down here to like, 0.5 seconds, that tends to generally be a little bit too fast for me. Like it's still there, it's still noticeable, but it's not quite what I'm looking for. Or something like that might be kind of good. Pre-delay here is also kind of up to you. I like it also in the like 10 to 20 milliseconds kind of area. I had somebody once tell me 13 milliseconds was the sweet spot, but he might have just been pulling that number out of his ass. Something like that could work. A lot of that pre-delay in there. Other than that, you can kind of like tweak these guys to taste. You can like switch up the room a little bit. Let's try. I like that a little better. A lot better. And then sometimes it can be fun to switch the color up just to see what happens. Ooh, that sounds kind of nice. Sounds exactly the same. Yeah, I don't mind that. And then we'll start adjusting the send knob to taste. Again, I want it to be audible, but I don't want it to be either more powerful than the snare or distract from the snare. I want it to be a supporting character. I want it to be like heard, but just barely. Which I think for something like this, if this was in the mix with a lot of this stuff, the levels here would change a little bit. Sometimes I've noticed that the send knobs and the reverbs in your return tracks can come off as a little quiet. So I will often compress them as well as also EQ them on its own separate return track over here. Because sometimes you get some like weird low frequencies in it. So let's wait for this to load. I can get rid of some of this stuff here. And then again, kind of dial those into taste, kind of however you want, but not always, but oftentimes compressor and an EQ after my snare reverb. Hey Josh, how are you doing today? So vintage verb is my go-to reverb for any realistic sounding reverb. If I want it to sound like it's in an actual space, vintage verb is my go-to. If I want it to sound like it's a science fiction, weird, abstract, magical space, then Valhalla Shimmer is my go-to. If I want to do some spacey stuff, Valhalla Space Echo is also excellent, and that one I believe is free. I don't think I have it installed on this computer yet, but that is a really fun one for making really kind of like things like delay. If you want like delay and reverb together and like things echoing and bouncing, I think it's called Space Verb. Is the one that sounds pretty good. So Josh is asking if I notice a noticeable difference between compressor versus gain bump to the send. There's going to be a very slight difference in terms of the function of them. Basically, this is going to be controlling the volume going into the reverb, whereas this will be controlling the volume coming out of the reverb. There's Supermassive. Is it Supermassive? There's one called Space something. That's a free one they did. Maybe I'm just thinking Supermassive, but it's super cool. I have it on my other computer. But yeah, so volume going in versus volume coming out. Yeah, there is like a slight bit of difference there. And I think this, bumping the compressor on the reverb will accentuate a bit more of the tail, and like if you wanted to the echo to be a little bit more audible, this will be a little bit more noticeable in that way. Space modulator. Let me just have my other computer right in front of me. I should just look it up to make sure I'm not just making things up. What is the name of that other one? Supermassive, yeah, that's the one I'm thinking of. Yeah, Supermassive is dope. And it's free. And that's totally worth checking out for doing bouncy reverbs. But yeah, that's kind of the general process in a really kind of generic way in terms of how I will be processing my snares. A little bit of compressor, a little bit EQ, reverb on ascend, a little bit of compressor and EQ on that as well. And then a lot of the like kind of details of how I go through that process is going to be dependent a lot on the song that I'm making, what style music it is, and what I'm looking to get out of my snares. Like how present in the mix does it need to be? Is it the kind of music where it can like sit back in the mix a little bit, or is the kind of thing, is it really like dancey? If it's dance music, the snare's got to be like super loud and clear in the mix, and it's got to cut through a lot of things. Sometimes I'll put my snares in mono, just using like a utility, and just hit the mono button on the utility. If I want my snare to be in mono, but yeah, that's kind of like the generic way that I will be processing my snare for the most part. So Alex is asking about how do you regulate how much bass is in your track while producing on headphones? Even in my monitor speakers, felt like the bass was reasonable. Then I listened on my car and sub nearly blew it. That can be really tricky. I found a lot of it comes down to practice and basically doing what you're doing, where you will, make music on your headphones and then switch to your speakers, either your studio speakers or your car speakers or whatever, and go back and forth. And then you kind of know, like, okay, if the bass is roughly at this level on my headphones, then it's going to be roughly this level in the car. If the bass is roughly this level in my headphones, it's going to be roughly this level on my speakers. And you can kind of start to know your gear and kind of predict a little bit about where it's going to be. It's not going to be super accurate. It's not going to be perfect. But you can at least start to realize, like, okay, if it's sounding this loud on one pair of speakers, it'll sound roughly this loud on a different pair of speakers if I know both of those speakers pretty well, and I've been using them for a long time. So I've been using these headphones forever. I've had these for, God, like, I don't know, 8 years, maybe 9 years. And I kind of know that if I mix my bass at, I can kind of know where it sounds good on my headphones, and then what that translates to other systems that I use to test out my music. But generally just know that like headphones are not going to be able to accurately recreate the sub. And so if the sub sounds really loud in your headphones, it's gonna be way too loud on something else. So just remember to like, tone it down a little bit. And then there are other options. You can try out things like a sub pack, for example. It's like a little backpack you wear, the speaker on it, and it'll play your sub, and so you can like feel the sub on your back. I've tried those, but I haven't like mixed the whole song with those, so I can't stand by them. But I know people who really like them and say it helps out with their mixing for sub and not pissing off all their neighbors. Or you can try things like SonarWorks. They have all these things where they'll kind of EQ your mix before it hits your headphones based off of the type of headphone that you have. So there are different like technological solutions out there for getting your low frequencies to sound good, even if you can't hear them super well. But I think a lot of it just comes down to practice. Just spend a lot of time listening really closely to how loud something sounds on your headphones, and then checking it on as many systems as you can, whether it's your cars or otherwise. But really, there's nothing that'll replace having like studio monitors in your studio and bumping those from time to time. I'm actually, my walls, my studio are not super thick, so I actually spend a lot of time producing on headphones, and then I'll always double check my stuff on my speakers. But if I'm producing like late at night or anything, I've got to do headphones all the way. So I produce mostly kind of down-tempo bass music that ranges anywhere from weird experimental ambient music to kind of hip-hoppy stuff to occasionally some kind of more like harder bass music kind of stuff. But I DJ all kinds of different music. I listen to all kinds of different music. Anything that's kind of like weird and good, I probably listen to, or at least have tried making at some point. I've been making more house music recently. I haven't released any or finished most of it, which is kind of weird for me because I tend to be much more kind of lower tempo kind of person, and then I'm like trying to figure out my approach to house music and having mixed results with it. Sweet. Well, I appreciate you guys coming at me with all these questions. Feel free to let me know if you got any more. I'm also going to do my mandatory shout out to the sample pack song challenge. This is the second one we're doing this month. And so there's another video on the channel where you can download the sample pack, and then you've got till the end of the month to make a track using those samples. And we will take a listen to those at the Friday feedback stream at the end of the month. Last month we had like 8 or so people do it, and so it'd be cool to see if we could get more people in on it. So if you want a challenge, a sample pack challenge, it is there for you. Sweet. Well, we've talked about a lot of stuff today. Feel free to, like I said, toss any other questions you have in the chat. I'm going to go back to playing this piano sound thing that Mike was asking about earlier. And let's run that through the vintage reverb there. So this is a good example. So I can hear there is a rogue frequency in here that is not good. So this would be a perfect example of a situation where you might want to use the hunt and kill method, because I can't see it, but I can hear it. So we're gonna bump this up, try to find it, use the solo button. I think it's that guy. So we're gonna tone that guy down. It might be both of these two, actually. We'll just do one big one. We'll do like that. Cool. So that's an example of a hunt and kill method where like there's a frequency. A lot of times if you have like reverbs on reverbs, you can get these kind of stacking frequencies that just kind of resonate forever. And that's one way to get rid of them. Yeah, Michael, I'm super picky about snares, both in terms of sample selection, like make sure you pick a really solid snare, make the sample is actually really good itself, and then processing. Spend some time with your snare, because if the snare does not slap, then the whole track can fall apart, especially if you're doing any kind of like dance music. So spend some time with it. Make sure you like get it sitting just the way you want, but you don't need to overthink it. All right, so I got this piano guy here. All right, so Alex is asking about when using operator to make wobble sounds, would you recommend cutting the lows and simply rely on sub bass and kicks for the bass, or is it appropriate to use an LFO for the bass notes? So it depends on your definition of bass and kind of where bass lives. I think of bass as like two different things. You have your sub bass, which is anything below like 100 hertz or so. That's like sub bass. And then you also have bass just in general, which is about 100 to 250 or so is kind of like the main core of that, maybe going up a little higher depending on what you're doing. So in my opinion, the only things that should live in that sub bass area under 100 hertz are your kick and your dedicated sub bass track, which is generally just going to be a sine wave. Any of your other bass sound design, so if you have like we're doing some operator. And we'll grab like a little spectrum analyzer here. So if I just have like a little square wave here, something like this, we're gonna have like one harmonic down here that's like a little under 100. That's probably fine. But if I have like something like that, we probably don't need this harmonic here. So we can probably EQ that out, because I'm going to have a separate track that's just a sine wave that's going to be handling that for me. So I think that's kind of what you're asking about. If you're doing a lot of like the mid-rangey bass sound design. You're doing something kind of like grimier like this. You can do that, but that's going to be adding to and competing with your sub bass and your kick. But if you do something like this, you still get all that nice griminess in there, but it gives you more room for your sub bass and your kick to actually do their thing. If you are not doing a dedicated sub bass, if you're like, for some reason didn't want to do that, you could totally just leave that in there and that should be fine. But oftentimes I think it's easier and cleaner just to have a separate dedicated sub bass track. Yeah, so you do all your like interesting, weird sound design, which is like, again, mostly going to be in this kind of area, right? It's like the 100 to 500 hertz area with a little bit more, depending on what you're doing. And then you have like a separate dedicated sub bass track that can do its own thing, and you can process it separately, which to me is usually just going to be a sine wave with maybe a little bit of saturator on it. That I think is kind of the key. Although there's some like weird stuff you can do with sub bass. So it's just gonna be one sub bass down in this kind of like 40 to 60 hertz range, a little bit of saturator. Beef it up a little bit, which gives you this a nice little extra harmonic, which is pretty handy. And then, like, that's all you need for sub bass. Josh, I have not tried Track Spacer, but I will have to check that out. I'm gonna write that down. Yeah, that looks super cool. A lot of times for like bass sounds, though, it's like you just kind of, one is anything below X hertz, where X is, somewhere between 60 and 100, and then anything above that is going to be your other track. Yeah, I have a bunch of stuff on Spotify and SoundCloud. I haven't been updating my SoundCloud in a while, but it's under the name Xenotope, Zenotope. That's my artist name that I release music under. I need to get my ass in gear and finish some more tracks and get this out of there. Been lazy about releasing for a while now. COVID just made me like not interested in releasing music for some reason. So Michael is asking about, I saw some vids where they always put a utility bass mono with everything that has a lot of low end. Thoughts on that? So in my opinion, again, anything in that sub bass area under 100 hertz, just flat out put it in mono. If you have a sound like some interesting, weird kind of wubby sound you're doing, they like might have some frequencies in there. The utility with the bass mono button is great because you do want anything in that kind of low frequency area to be in mono. So you can hit the bass mono button, and that way, if you do have anything, in this case, under 120 hertz, we'll put it in mono, and that's a great thing to do. Or if you're feeling lazy about it, you can just put the whole thing in mono, and that will also work. Like, you're not going to hear that much difference there. But yeah, I definitely agree that bass, sub bass, kick should be in mono. If you have something that has a lot of mid ranges, so say for example, you put like a chorus on this, which is a fun thing to put on a sound like this. It's going to give it this nice kind of widening effect that can be really cool. In this case, I'd use the bass mono button, and that way I still get that widening effect on the mid-range, but anything that's lower will still be in mono. Whereas if I put it back in mono, you lose a lot of that kind of widening effect that the chorus gives it. So anything that has a lot of mid-range or width to it that you want to maintain, but also has some low frequencies to it, use the bass mono button. If it's already in, if it's already pretty straightforward or it's really low frequency, just use the regular mono button. But yeah, I think it's a super solid thing to do. So Josh was saying about the Track Spacer plugin that I have not tried yet. Used to do a lot of sidechain compression to fit things, like sidechain only syncs the vocals, but now Track Spacer is going to go to. Interesting. Yeah, I'm definitely gonna see if I can get like a demo version of this and try it out. I'm like, haven't been big on buying new plugins recently, but this one seems pretty reasonable, and it serves a function that is very useful. The name Peekaboo, Alex, sounds familiar, but not off the top of my head. I feel like I might have seen that name on a lineup recently or seen it somewhere, but I don't think I'm familiar with their music. So we have not done any like sound design stuff recently, but this is something I'll do quite a bit with students when I'm doing lessons in person. Is they'll just bring me tracks and we'll have to listen to a sound and try to recreate it from scratch. Let me pull that up actually. Is there a particular sound in that track, or just the whole thing in general? Just sounds in the drop. All right. Pull this up here. And I'm at to do some audio niggling. Give me 1 second so you guys can actually hear what's going on. Oops, wrong thing. All right, where did the thing go? There we go. That's what I was looking for. Okay, let me know if you guys cannot hear this once I start playing it. So at 146, let me do one more thing with the volume. So the little bass line at 146, the that one. Yeah, that sounds like not too complicated. It's just gonna be a lot of like weird wavetable stuff with like a little bit of squawkiness in the filter. Yeah, it has this very like wet sound to it, which is gonna be probably the trickiest part, but we'll go ahead and try it. So these kinds of sounds, I mean, he's probably using Serum because everybody uses Serum. You can use almost any wavetable synth to create this kind of stuff. And I probably won't be able to get it exact because I have no idea exactly which wavetable he's using. But there's a few basic things that we can try to like start with to kind of get us at least roughly in the right ballpark. So when I'm doing this kind of sound design, I think it helps to have one oscillator be kind of basic, either a saw wave or a square wave. And the reason for that is these kinds of waveforms have a lot of power to them. They have a really nice, rich and wide frequency range. So, and there's, that's the reason they're like the basic building blocks of all synthesis. So we're going to start and just keep it boring on one of these, either a saw wave or a square wave. Either one's fine. I'm going to go with square, but either one will work. So we're going to turn that off, and we're going to go over to the other oscillator. And this is where we're going to have to do the magic. This is where a lot of like the character of the sound is going to be coming in. So here we're going to go and pick some kind of interesting thing. I really like the 3 folders here, the collection, complex, or distortion. There's some good stuff in all of these. So what we're going to do is we're going to be looking for a sound that gets us that kind of like wet, gooey, morphing kind of sound. And so we'll start with a collection. And the issue is if I go through right now, and try to like listen to these. They sound cool, but they're not going to give me the full picture of what's going on here, because a lot of these wavetables are designed for motion or movement. So if I want to give them that motion movement, I'm going to just take LFO1 and just apply it to oscillator 2 position like that. So now we actually get the full, I don't say full, but we get the richness of what this wavetable is actually doing. So now as I go through and I'm basically auditioning these sounds, I'll actually be able to hear what's going on. That's kind of cool. That's cool, but maybe not quite what we're going for. That could be cool. You can also move the wavetable position around to kind of like see how it sounds in different places. That could work. That could be something that could be kind of what we're going for. Well, I like that one a lot. Let's go back to our reference track real quick, just so we can hear it again. Oh, is live too quiet? Oh, I turned it down because SoundCloud is loud. I will turn it back up in just a second. Yeah, it's got that sound. All right, I'm gonna turn live back up. Turn it back up here. That could work. All right, there are a few back here in the collection that I want to try one more time to see how they sound. I might stick with this one. The other thing I'll often do here is I might pitch the weirder one up an octave, just to give it a put it in a different octave, so that way this is going to be sitting in kind of lower frequency range, and this is going to be a higher frequency range, like that. So by kind of dividing and conquering here, we're getting the best of both worlds. We're getting one oscillator to be our just pure, big, beefy sound that's in the lower frequency range. And then we have our weird oscillator that has a lot of motion and movement to it. And then that's going to be like sitting in a slightly higher frequency range, like that. So by combining these two things, it gives us a nice kind of like solid core for our sound design. Love, if you can't make it on Friday, you can still upload a track early and I will take a listen to it. And that way you can watch the video later on if you want to send something. Cool. So that gives us our starting point. And again, I might switch up this oscillator and just try different things until I find the one that most closely resembles the kind of sound we're going for. So that's one thing that's going on. And then let's go back to our reference track and listen to what else we might have going on. Okay. And then from there, I hear this kind of like squanchy sound. I don't know how to describe it. That to me sounds like a low pass filter with an LFO moving up and down. And I think the thing that's making this stand out and kind of give it its kind of personality, give it that special sauce, is it sounds like there's a bunch of resonance on the filter, which is helping it give it that kind of squonkiness. So that way, as it moves up, you can hear that like these frequencies be especially loud. So with that, now we have motion on both of the wavetail position as well as the filter frequency with a bunch of resonance. And then from here, I need to speed this up because it's too slow right now. So we're going to sync it to the grid and probably change our tempo to be 140 or so. and then make this less noticeable. I don't know, something around there. And then we can start tweaking these to kind of like dial them in. Oh, feedback loop. Sorry about that. Is the microphone gonna die? Is the microphone still alive? Oh no. All right. I'm gonna reset this and see what happens. All right, should be back up and running. Sorry about the technical difficulties. Feedback loops are just part of my life now. Where did the stream go? Oh, there it is. All right, we're back up and running. Everything working? Sweet. So yeah, so that's kind of my recipe for getting started with this kind of sound, and then we gotta like start tweaking it and dialing it in and start tossing some effects on it. I'm just gonna make sure that there's no more feedback loops and everything is working still. Give me 1 second. All right, so that should go there. Yeah, you guys wouldn't believe the technical hoops I've got to jump through just to make all of the audio work in this situation. What's up, Kevin? How are you doing today? Yeah, no worries, Alex. I mean, that's what this whole stream is about, is just kind of hanging out and talking about weird music stuff. All right, so let's go back in here and listen to the reference track one more time. Yeah, getting that squeaky sound, I think it's going to be like all about getting that resonance in there. So, all right, so here's the thing I'm noticing now is that I kind of want the speed of my oscillator 2 to be different than my filter frequency, but maybe I'll just tone it down and see. Yeah, that's kind of getting us a little closer. So again, you have the saw wave or square wave. I think it sounds better with the saw wave. The weird shape here. And you can just kind of audition all the different wavetables you want until you find the one that kind of like fits the vibe you're going for. This one, I love the bit ring one. The bit ring sounds great. It's not what he was using, but it gives you that like vowel-y, bit crushy kind of sound. This one's kind of nice. Yeah, just kind of tweaking this kind of till you figure out what you're going for. All right, we're gonna go back again. Something like that. And then from here, we can start tossing some effects on it. So effects that kind of come to mind, distortion on this kind of sound can go really, really well. Too much distortion will make it lose a lot of its properties, but and a lot of this kind of sound design, what they're doing is tends to be very light on the synthesis side of things and then very heavy on the effects sides of things. So besides let's talk about distortion first. Pedal is excellent. Overdrive is excellent. Those are two of my go-tos for just distortion in general. So gives you some like really harsh aggressive sounds, and then you can of course turn the dry wet down and turn the sub on. Can be kind of nice. So something like that could work to help kind of like grid it up a little bit. Something like the overdrive can work really well. The filter on overdrive, it also works really well to kind of like hone in and get distortion right where you want it. To like emphasize some more of those high frequencies or mids or lows. Another one that's really great, not particularly for the sound that we're trying to go for, is erosion. This is like a secret weapon for a lot of people to get that little bit of extra like high-end crispness to their sound design. Just gives it that extra like nice little bit of noise. And I like the wide noise setting the best. The sine wave one's kind of annoying. It works in this situation, but yeah, between these three, you can get like a nice solid little extra layer of like crispness and grime on whatever your sound design is. I used the Camel Crusher one like way back in the day. I have not used it recently, but in terms of like saturators / distortions, FabFilter Saturn would probably be the one I would recommend to everybody. It just sounds great, and you can do anything you want with it. I think the iZotope Trash is really solid. However, it's overly complicated for what you need it to do, in my opinion. One of the things I love about like particularly these three devices is that they're all really straightforward. There's only like a handful of like buttons or knobs controls on any one of these. So it's really hard to screw them up. Whereas iZotope Trash can do a million things, but there's a million features in it. And so I end up taking a lot of time to get Trash to sound the way I want, that I would rather spend that time doing other things. But Saturn is just like across the board, just a really, really solid plugin. Almost everything FabFilter makes is excellent. But for a lot of my distortion, I just use the live in the box stuff. Other kinds of effects that I think would go well on this kind of sound for this style of sound design. Chorus can go really well to add like some interesting width to it. Especially if you turn up the amount here. Gives it this nice like extra little bit of like width and buzziness to it. If you're going to be doing this on something like this that's really bassy, you can do what we talked about earlier, which is toss a utility with the bass mono on it. As well as things like the phaser. Phaser is amazing on sounds like this, to give it that like extra little bit of interesting kind of like motion and movement in there. So you can like turn this down. And just adds like, you know, this extra little bit to any of the kind of like sound design you're doing. So start stacking effects on here and kind of dial it in from there. Dimension expander is great. You can use the one that's built into Serum if you're using Serum. But yeah, this is kind of like a general gist of how I'd make something kind of like this. The actual like the super squawkiness of this. Yeah, it sounds like you got to get really in there with the resonance on the filter and like really kind of dial that up quite a bit. There you go. It's hard to get that level of squawkiness on the resonance without it being like way too over the top. Yeah, that's kind of what I'm hearing. Yeah, it's like not quite that much. That just sounds kind of cool. Yeah, that's getting there. But yeah, that's gonna be kind of my processing workflow. Was there a pitch bend on that sound? I don't think there's a pitch bend. Yeah, maybe there is, but maybe it's subtle, but a little bit less. Getting that resonance just right is going to be a huge pain in the ass. Yeah, they're like... Yeah, something like that. So yeah, that's kind of like a real kind of like basic overview. I didn't get quite as close as I wanted to, but I think it's going to be spending a lot of time with that filter. Maybe trying some of the different filter modes in here because they have different shapes. Actually, I like that quite a bit. Yeah. So Kevin is asking, do you have any advice for getting that deep heaviness that Apache uses in his bass? I've tried tricks like Renaissance bass and other harmonic tools, and I can't get it. Honestly, I think a lot of his basses are pretty straightforward. I think that he makes them sound really complicated, but I think a lot of them are just like saw waves and distortion, and just like dialing in those two things like to perfection. I think it depends a lot on what song he's making, and like some of his songs are a little bit more like neuro drum and bassy, and some of them are a little bit more kind of like hip hop, just like big wall of bass sounds. But honestly, I would just try something like this. As like a starting point, just a square wave running through pedal with the fuzz setting with the sub turned on. Put monophonic, put a little glide on there. As just kind of like a basic starting point. And then from there, start to like grid it up a little bit more, again, kind of like depending on your taste. So like maybe a little bit of chorus on it. Maybe a little bit less than the dry wet there. Those kinds of things, and just like don't feel like you need to overprocess it. I guess it would help to have an example if you have like a particular bass sound that you're going for. But a lot of time when I hear his tracks, I just hear like just big square waves or big saw waves. That kind of thing. Yeah, let me know if there's a particular track or bass line you want me to look up, because if we're talking about the more kind of like weird neuro stuff, you can take something like this as a starting point and then like use just the notch filter. And then put a little LFO on that bad boy. That's a way to get some like cool, interesting motion in there without it being like too over the top. But a unison. That can work pretty well. All right, let's check out Lord and Master. All right, and you said it's 135. Are we talking about the big sub, or are we talking about the choppy one? The sub is fascinating. I got some ideas, but that's really interesting. All right, well, let's talk about that sub bass, because that sub bass is super distorted. And I think there's probably some really interesting, I'm going to delete some of these tracks that we're not using anymore. We'll just keep using wavetable, just because I like wavetable. So yeah, so it sounds like he's just taken super low sine wave and just like absolutely like slamming it through a bunch of saturation and distortion. So just out of curiosity, if we were to like take the soft clip, turn it on here, and do something like that. Something like that. Yeah, there's definitely like a lot of different stuff going on here. But I'm curious if we took something like this, which is like giving it all this interesting. I have no idea if this is actually how I do it. This is just me just guessing, basically. Taking something like this, where you basically like, you have this sine wave, just a sine wave, and then you're just adding a bunch of harmonics with your saturation. And then if you were to add like an LFO on that, just to see what would happen to like give it this like interesting saturated motion, where we started at 50%. I don't know. Something like that would be probably like a good starting point. So that way you get this sub that's very much a sub. It's very much like that low end sine wave. And then you get the motion on the distortion to make it sound like it's shifting and moving and also really distorted at the same time. I don't know. And then a little slower than that. That could be one way to like start approaching it. If we're talking about, again, the sub there. Yeah, and it's moving at like a different speed as the like the choppy things. Yeah, you always think of things to challenge me, Kevin. Maybe even start this even higher. Let's get even higher. And just have that kind of move around, or like instead of using the LFO, use an envelope. So each note, it kind of like just moves up and down once, which is kind of what it sounds like it's doing a little bit. And like you could try also just keep on stacking more distortion, which is like, when in doubt, if you're doing sound design these days, just keep on adding more distortion. I don't know, something like that. It's crazy how much sound design you can do by just starting with just a sine wave and then just keep on putting more effects on it. I feel like it's how a lot of people are doing their sound design these days. All right, and then let's put that on this as well. Yeah, and so the choppy bass, like the more like melodic bassy part has a totally different like set of rhythm to it. But I don't know. This is kind of maybe where I'd start going as far as like how to start doing that bass sound design, and then probably run this through like 3 OTTs and then keep on. Yeah, Joshua beat me to it. Run it through a bunch of OTTs, and then boom, there's your gigantic, enormous, distorted sub bass that he's got going on. And then chop it up, like cut it out so it kind of like goes on and off. Yeah, it's super interesting. Yeah, the sub has this like really long kind of rolling motion to it, and everything else is moving really fast, which is cool. Apache's so good. He's like such a good producer. Yeah, so we already played some other tracks, so my channel's not even monetized yet anyway. I need like a couple hundred more hours of view time, so if you guys want to help me get monetized, just put my videos on repeat in the background until I get a couple more hours of just channel view time. So yeah, so it doesn't matter if I'm demonetized anyway. I'm not making any money off this to begin with. But yeah, that's I'll keep playing around with it. That kind of like big, heavy, distorted sine wave bass. I think there's probably some different avenues we can take a look at doing to try to like make that work a little more. But I mostly just think it's just sine wave and distortion, and then like maybe I don't even think you'd put any effects on it. I think that's all you need. But the question is, how much distortion and getting those settings just right and getting that motion and movement just right. I think more than anything else. Sweet. Well, you guys rocked it today with the questions and the just participation in chat. You guys all get bonus points for that. I appreciate it. That always makes these streams super fun when you guys have topics you want to talk about, because otherwise it's just me sitting here talking at my screen. But I'm probably going to call it for the evening. I will be back on Friday for another song feedback stream. If you want to send me your track beforehand, go ahead. The link is in the Discord, and you can go check that out. Or if you can't make that, even if you can't make it to the Friday stream, you can still upload your track, and I will take a listen to it during the stream, and you can always watch the stream later on. Also, as always, if you are not yet subscribed, go ahead and hit the subscribe button. Or if you already are subscribed, go ahead and just watch my videos and like and comment and interact to feed the algorithm. Nice. I like it when people take notes. That's what that's what office hours are for. So, Michael, appreciate you being here. Starting us off with a lot of really good questions today. Yeah, we talked a lot of different stuff. I am wondering a little bit if you guys are digging this kind of format for the Tuesday streams. Do you like the just kind of like smorgasbord, like whatever comes up kind of thing? Do you want me to do more focused things, like pick a topic and we'll just kind of focus on that topic for a while? What are you guys into? Yeah, I like this format a lot because it means I don't need to prepare anything, and we can kind of just go down rabbit holes as they happen. But I'm always looking for ways to improve the channel and the stream. So if you come up with any ideas on ways to make this better, definitely let me know. Cool. Yeah, I enjoy this style as well. Sweet. Well, I appreciate you guys, and I will hopefully see you on Friday. If not, I'll see you back here next Tuesday for the next one of these streams. Have a good evening, and go ahead and make some more tracks. I'll see you later.